You know that feeling where something just clicks? When you really can't put your finger on why, but you're almost immediately drawn towards it right off the bat? That's exactly how I felt with Ghost of Tsushima. The weird thing is, it doesn't reinvent the wheel or really even do anything groundbreaking with its open world, characters, story, or gameplay, but it does most of those things very well. When you add the sum of all those parts together, that translates into a great game. It just doesn't really have any specific weak points. I never had a time where this game felt like it slowed down or I was just pushing through certain sections to get to the fun stuff again. That doesn't mean it's flawless though. Anymore, we constantly hear games being called a masterpiece or described as perfect. In my last video, I mentioned how if there's a perfect game out there, I haven't played it yet. Every game has some type of flaw, even if they're awesome. For me, what makes a great game is making it so I don't care about those flaws, and that was something Ghost of Tsushima easily pulled off. When I make these videos, I try to look at both the pros and cons of not just the gameplay, but the plot too, because I think a lot of reviews or critiques are kinda bland anymore. It feels like most people just have a checklist of things they need to touch on every time, and almost always avoid any real criticisms, even if they love the game. When I was going over my notes and started writing this script, I was honestly pretty surprised at my pros and cons list. It's still way heavier on the pros side, but there were more cons than I remembered. To be fair, most of them are problems that tend to arise with the open world format in general and aren't specific to this game though. That's the beauty of Ghost of Tsushima. None of the things that I had noted as criticisms of the game stopped me from thoroughly enjoying it. It was just stuff I noticed along the way, but was definitely overshadowed by the amount of good content available. Because this is a great game and I don't have much to talk about in terms of its downsides, let's get that negative technical difficulty stuff out of the way first. There will be story spoilers going forward too. So I played this on a base PS4 and there were some hiccups at times. After I was done, I looked it up and saw a lot of similar complaints. Apparently it runs much smoother on the PS4 Pro and PS5, which makes plenty of sense. I'm playing a pretty visually demanding game on a console that's almost 10 years old and at the end of its life cycle. Nothing terrible, no crashes or anything, but enough that it was definitely noticeable here and there. Things like this guy not having a face during an intense cutscene, animals spawning on roofs, or Mongols in the open world just disappearing did happen frequently enough to notice. There would also be weird things like this clip that's on screen now. It was still early on in the game and I was getting overwhelmed by enemies. In the process of trying to create some distance, I managed to get Jin stuck on the scenery, then I randomly teleported back into the middle of the road. These kind of things don't stop you from doing anything in-game, but you can't help but get taken out of the experience a little because it just looks goofy and a little unpolished. If they programmed it into the game to teleport me out of that scenario, then it means that the developers were aware things like this could happen. Wouldn't it just make more sense to take out that pile of logs from the camp? They're close enough to the fence that you can't really use them for cover, so why even have them there if there's a chance it could mess with the gameplay? If you don't take them out altogether, then just slide them forward a little bit so there's enough room for Jin to get behind them without getting stuck. There are little issues like this that, at least on the surface, seem like they should be easy fixes that were overlooked. Things in the open world, like rocks, fences, or statues, can cause Jin's animations to spaz out a little bit when he's not on solid ground. He gets stuck on them kinda easily, and trying to jump over sometimes makes his character model kinda glide around while still holding his jump position. The little yellow birds that help you get to hidden locations have frustrating AI sometimes. Unless you're running across flatter ground, they tend to just fly into houses, rocks, or trees. When this happens, the game usually just despawns them, and when they pop back in, they'll circle around for a little bit or start leading you in the wrong direction before getting back on track again when their AI resets. This isn't a big deal, but there are probably around 100 of these birds in the game, so even though it's a minor annoyance, it can happen more than a few times. Because there are so many of those birds, they will show up when you're in the middle of side quests and story missions too. When you're doing missions or trying to clear a Mongol camp and these little guys are just flying around constantly chirping, it gets distracting and, more importantly, again, just kind of annoying. I'm sure this didn't bother other players as much as it did me, but I would have liked an option to turn the birds off and on. When I play open world games, I tend to do exploring and story missions in chunks. If I'm dicking around and exploring for an afternoon, I'd rather the birds were on. If I'm planning on doing 4 or 5 story missions in a row, then they were just kind of a bother to have flying around every couple minutes. This is all minor stuff though. I feel like it should still be noted, cause that's the whole point of these style of videos, but I'm far from a frame rate perfectionist or need games to run perfectly to have fun. As long as the game runs and it's not completely broken, I can overlook these minor things pretty easily, and they don't bother me if the game as a whole is good. However, there was one big issue I did have from a technical standpoint though. This didn't start happening to me until later in the game, but I did have several Mongol camps where the hostages and enemies just wouldn't spawn in. After spending another 10 minutes looking for them and finding nothing, I'd have to exit and close the game, reload a manual save, and hope that they popped in. Usually it worked on the first try, but I did have one where I had to reload 3 times before they showed up and let me finish the camp. For whatever reason, this happened in all the camps where I was looking for the Khan's armor pieces, while it only happened twice with all the other camps combined. What made it worse was having to use that manual save and hope that I didn't just save the glitch and break my mission, or worse, my game's progression, because at the time I didn't know if these were mandatory to clear out or not. This was kind of stressful to do each time because it didn't start happening until I already had around 40 hours into the save file. On a side note, did we really need an animation and quick dialogue between Jin and every single person he freed? In the open world, whatever, it's a way to get Jin more supplies, but when a lot of the camps and missions start turning into saving hostages instead of just killing the Mongols, it gets repetitive really quickly. By the end of the game, I felt like Jin had the same go somewhere safe animation with like 100 hostages. Again, usually I don't give a shit about stuff like this, and I'm very on the side of, dude, just wait 15 seconds and stop being impatient. But I found myself getting really impatient with these quick scenes by the end of the game. I really wanted to just cut their hand bindings and run away instead of watching those little scenes over and over and over, and goddamn it, over again. Like I said, none of these are game breaking, but there are enough problems that they need to be noted. The ones that showed up from a technical standpoint seem to be more frequent with the base PS4. It wouldn't surprise me if anyone playing on the updated consoles really didn't experience much of these. Before getting into the characters in the story, I do want to touch on the open world a little bit first. Now, I don't think this is a straight up weak point by any means, but if I had to pick Ghost of Tsushima's weakest point, I would say it's with the open world. Like I said in the intro, these aren't as much of a Ghost of Tsushima problem, as it's a general problem with a lot of open world games, so keep that in mind for this section. The landscapes look great and the colors are beautifully placed. They do have a black and white mode to honor the old school samurai movies, which is an awesome thing to include, but I never wanted to use it because I felt like it did an injustice to the great visuals and scenery in the game. Graphically, Ghost of Tsushima looks fantastic. I'm not trying to downplay that at all. It's definitely one of the best looking games of the PS4 generation. For me, personally though, I'm not all that worried about amazing graphics. It's something that can definitely be the cherry on top of a great game, but it's not something that I tend to single out as what makes a game better. I'm more worried about the game being fun and the plot being well written than how good it looks on my TV. I feel like I'm kinda in the minority with that, especially when it comes to open world games. It seems like a lot of people love just riding around, looking at the scenery, thinking how great it looks, and equating that to making the game better. Which it entirely does if that's something you're into. People seem to love the photo mode, but that's not a feature that I'm personally really interested in. Again, if it's something that you're into, then it's a great addition that you'll definitely love spending time on. It's just not a feature that I really used. I don't know. I take good graphics as more of an added bonus, and that's exactly what Ghost of Tsushima falls into. For me, the most important part of an open world game is what's actually in that open world. What's in Ghost of Tsushima's open world can get a little repetitive as the game goes on. The story, characters, and combat are great throughout, but I feel like the world building and its activities are definitely at its strongest in Act 1. That's not to say it's bad or unenjoyable for Acts 2 and 3, but you probably will get a little bit of a been there, done that feeling as the game progresses to its later stages. The little villages and strongholds feel very interchangeable. I understand that this is feudal Japan and not modern cities or anything like that, but I played the game for 50 hours and I don't know if I could tell them apart if I was showed screenshots. The only locations that really stood out were the few hub cities. Villages especially feel lackluster as the game goes on. At first, they're cool and new, but after Act 1, they just become another place to run around the edges of buildings mashing R2 looking for supplies. Mongol camps rarely switch up the formula to the point that those supplies and artifacts are usually sitting in the exact same places in each camp. Instead of taking in the scenery, I was trained to run to specific spots because I knew that's where the loot was, and that's all I was really taking in. I did love the platforming aspects in Ghost of Tsushima though. To me, there is almost nothing more frustrating in the open world genre than needing to go 30 feet in-game, but having to go 300 feet instead because there's a goddamn mountain I need to take the long way around. I get it. You can't make an open world game with an entirely flat texture, but I was so grateful for the ability to easily climb those mountains here. It solved the problem of wasting time running around mountains for me. It made me feel like Jin was this trained samurai, and most importantly, it streamlined how I could get where I wanted to go. Ghost of Tsushima did a really good job of keeping you involved when you're doing these scripted jumps too. The sections aren't difficult, but you can still fall while using them. It does keep you more engaged when most games are just push the stick in one direction and the game does the rest of the work for you. Now, by modern open world standards, this map isn't huge, but I do feel like it could have been like 20% smaller. Maybe not that much, but a little smaller. If it wasn't made smaller, a little more variation in what you can do would have helped. For example, at first, Inari Shrines and Fox Dens are really cool and do a great job to help build the setting. It's an interesting way of doing world building that I loved seeking out. By the end, did we really need to do this 49 times? Wouldn't following a fox 30 times have still been enough? I barely touched my charms for the second half of the game, so it didn't even really feel necessary to try and keep upgrading them. The bamboo strikes were cool, and there were only 16 of them. I would have gladly taken another minigame like that with, say, 15 locations, rather than close to 50 fox shrines. I felt the same way with haikus. After doing around 9 or 10 of them, I found myself not paying much attention and then missing the subject I was supposed to be making a haiku about. Even though the dialogues were very quick, I liked the hot springs because it gave us a brief glimpse into relaxed Jin's thoughts. For that second, he didn't have to uphold his samurai side and could think freely. Quick thoughts of everything from his family to wishing he had some sake or the company of a girl. When we got the Straw Hat duels in Act 2, those were a lot of fun to stumble upon. I loved the idea of Jin's growing ghost reputation working against him, in a sense that now certain people wanted to challenge him rather than support him. Ghost of Tsushima definitely does significantly more good with its open world content, but I felt like they just went to the same well too many times with a couple of its side activities. I get the feeling that the whole open world fatigue thing is pretty strong with me at the moment too. But I was also feeling this way about a handful of story elements too. There's a couple locations in Act 1 where I was trying to clear Mongol camps but couldn't, only to then realize that was because I was here before the game intended for me to be there. Komatsu Forge and the southwestern beach where I got stuck on that log pile definitely come to mind. One mission had me reigniting a lighthouse that I had already lit too. The cutscene even randomly just turned off the flame in the lighthouse during the mission intro because it had to reset itself in order to play the story mission. It's kind of frustrating for me when they give you the freedom to go wherever you want, but then restrict what you can do when you get there because it clashes with the mandatory mission structure. But this is an issue that people have had with open world games for years, and it's something that I'm sure will continue to happen for years to come. So it's not like this is a problem unique to Ghost of Tsushima by any means. Unless it's a game like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring that doesn't really have much linear plot progression, it's a necessary evil of the genre. You can't really avoid it, and it's basically a part of the experience anymore. One conflicting thing that I thought was avoidable was when you first reach the second part of the island. You have this new area to explore, but then they immediately let you know that Mongol camps you cleared in Act 1 have been recaptured. You need to not only liberate them, but you need to do so in order to get keys that unlock a new armor. I didn't want to get interrupted after I started Act 2, so I went back and did the Mongol camps right away. Shortly after in Act 2, I'm having a conversation with an NPC about where to find some keys that I've already collected. It's just kind of weird to play, it throws you off a little bit. Why give me the option to go back and liberate those camps right after taking Castle Canada, if I wasn't meant to do it until a few missions later? There's also plenty of missions where you need to go to a certain designated spot, just to then rush in and attack Mongols anyway. Why do I need to go hide somewhere just to run out and attack? These are just more examples of open world struggling between player freedom and the game's needing control. Things like that last one are likely more of triggers so the game knows to initiate the next sequence of events and avoid a loading screen, but there's plenty of times where enemies rush in or show up during character conversations seamlessly, so I don't understand where the disconnect is sometimes. Another thing that the game did extremely well in the open world was its side quests. Like I said, those little gripes I just rattled off tend to plague a lot of the open world genre in general. Side quests are usually very hit or miss with open world games, but Ghost of Tsushima is significantly further to the hit side. The best thing I can say about them is that I forgot most of the side missions were just that, optional side missions. Act 1 revolves around introducing the characters, rescuing Lord Shimura, and retaking Castle Canada. Act 2 is about recruiting Yarikawa and retaking Castle Shimura. Act 3 is about Jin accepting himself as the ghost, fully aligning with Yuna, and then defeating the Khan. Those are very quick explanations, but nowhere in there did I mention how you need to complete anyone else's stories that were introduced in Act 1. Once you initiate Ishikawa, Yuriko's, and Masako's questlines, you don't have to finish them. I'm pretty sure you can skip Kenji and Norio's questlines altogether if you choose to. Hell, even though Yuna is a main character, you can skip some of her missions as well. It never really occurred to me to even do that. Instead of just rushing into the gold icon story progression missions, I wanted to see what these characters had to offer, and it never felt like I was grinding through optional content. It just felt like I was playing the mandatory game. The NPC dialogue bubble quest lines were pretty good too. Looking back, the majority were just talk to this person and go kill the Mongols or bandits that harmed them, but they each told a small story that really helped with world building. For a quick example, early on, we see a woman take advantage of Jin's initial naivety, lying to him about bandits stealing her food because she's starving, and this lie led to Jin killing the bandits and giving her food that wasn't hers to start with. Her reasoning being, well, they were bandits and stole that food from someone else, so why shouldn't they pay regardless, especially if she's starving? This is a theme that gets repeated a lot in the game. Everyone from bandits to peasants to even other feudal lords trying to use the Mongol attack to their advantage. Most characters are just doing so to try and survive the invasion, while others use it for straight up self-gain. But there is a weird sense of realism in this fictional retelling. Most of these side quests don't end well for people, whether they have done something wrong or are completely innocent victims. Even the ones whose lives you save tend to lose their homes or family members in the process. Very few of them seem to have a happy ending or reunion. It's not just the main cast of characters that gets fleshed out side quests. They took the time to put small, interesting stories into each quest that's randomly given to Jin by the common people of Tsushima. It also helps build the story up when we see the common people really flock to Jin's cause and even start to form their own militia to try and aid his mission. It's them repaying the favors when he listened to their stories and cries for help. Hands down, the best part, nothing really felt like a fetch quest either. With modern games in general, regardless of the genre, pointless fetch quests that are just used to bloat the content tend to be extremely overused, and I never really got that feeling that Ghost of Tsushima was falling into that trope. The mythic tales are a nice change of pace too. Playing on Japanese storytelling and folklore, Jin can search out legendary weapons, techniques, and armor, accompanied by the stories and battles that surround them. These aren't just giving Jin items to go get. Jin openly seeks out these items because he believes he needs every advantage he can get when it comes to stopping the Mongols. While the game follows the usual go here, meet up with this character, then go somewhere else and do what they need, open world style mission sequence, Ghost of Tsushima just felt like they accomplished that structure way better than most. As I always say in my videos, I'm a sucker for a well-written story with good characters, so let's finally get into that stuff. The game starts with a bang as it opens up with the Mongol army already reaching the beaches of Tsushima Island. I think what really grabbed me initially with this is how it's based in realism even though it's telling the fictional legend of the ghost. Tsushima Island is a real island sitting between South Korea and Japan. It was also really invaded by the Mongols, and they really fought a group of samurai on Komoda Beach. We don't know if it's true or not, but there's also a tale of a single samurai who stood out and killed a ton of Mongols before falling. Just like in the game, the group of samurai defending the island fell on Komoda Beach, fighting a battle they knew they had no chance of winning. The characters, though, are completely made up. Jin and Lord Shimura are 100% fiction. Kublai Khan did lead the invasion of Japan, but his cousin Khoten we meet in the game is a fictional character as well. During the real-life events, a massive storm destroyed a lot of the Mongol fleet. This slowed their attacks and further invasion of the island, something else that the game uses as a plot point during the final fight with the Khan. Locals called this storm the Divine Wind, which was very likely the thought process behind the guiding wind that helps Jin get to his destinations. Anyway, we get to see the Samurai Code of Honor and really just a last-ditch effort to scare off the Mongols. Shimura sends out Lord Adachi to challenge the Mongols' best fighter one-on-one. Khoten quickly shows that the Mongols aren't here to fight the samurai way, they're here to conquer by any means necessary. From what I've read, samurai fought significantly more with bows and distance attacks back then than they did with the flashy katana fighting that modern media has adopted. Sword fighting was used as more of a necessity than a first or even really second option. Either way, the Code of Honor for this time frame is said to be pretty accurate, as well as their attitude of fighting to an honorable death over surrendering. A lot of their honor code style of combat was thrown out the window as time went on, but this fight to the death even in the face of defeat attitude stayed with Japan as far as World War II. Even when it was basically Japan versus the world and America started dropping atomic bombs, there were still plenty of Japanese war generals and cabinet members that fully opposed Emperor Hirohito's intention of signing a decree of surrender. Hell, kids as young as 14 were forced to, quote-unquote, volunteer for the military. Some as young as 17 were even conscripted into kamikaze missions that they accepted for fear of dishonoring themselves, their parents, and their lineage. There were plenty of people in Japan that would rather die as a nation than give up even when the rest of the Axis powers had fallen and the war was unwinnable. Again, this was in 1945, not that long ago by modern standards. Imagine how strong this honor code of fighting till the death was during the game's feudal time frame. This was something that I really loved about Ghost of Tsushima. A huge plot point is Jin's fighting tactics and how the people of Tsushima view his win by any means necessary attitude. On one side, we have Lord Shimura and the supporters of Japanese traditions that would rather fight the samurai way and die trying. On the other, Jin knows what he's doing is viewed as essentially a war crime, but slowly doesn't care. His main goal is to keep the people of Tsushima safe and not have all this be for nothing. This rallies the commoners behind him, yet is something that Lord Shimura even admits that the shogun and other lords see as a threat to the entire makeup of their feudal society. This theme of Jin fighting honorably or using his ghost tactics was something that stood out so strongly to me that it actually changed the way I initially played the game. In the early goings, I tried to just charge in and fight like the characters of the game seemingly wanted me to do. As players, we're so trained to expect multiple endings or branching paths that I wanted to go the so-called honorable route. I was already thinking about the endgame, and when I had my inevitable clash with the Khan, I wanted the game to recognize that I got there as a samurai was supposed to. As a personal preference in games, I'd much rather rush in and create some havoc over a slower, more stealthy approach. This seemed perfect to me then. I can fight within the game's honor code, and it fits into what I feel like is the more fun way to play. I actually got a little bummed out when the game would force me into a more stealthy style during some missions because I thought that counteracted how I wanted Jin to play. This sentiment I held would change big time as I played though, which I'll get into in a minute. I thought the combat was one of the high points of the game though. It's a system that lets you make it as basic or as complex as you want. You can go nuts with arrows, thrown weapons, chaining stealth kills, sticky bombs, parries, smoke screens, different combos, and using environmental hazards to your advantage, or you can simply run in and hack and slash the shit out of people. The only thing that becomes a must is getting used to changing stances on the fly. Using the wrong stances against the wrong enemy isn't impossible to win with, but you're putting yourself at a huge disadvantage in combat. There is a little bit of a lag sometimes in changing stances though. Combat is pretty fast paced, and a lot of the time you're going to have multiple enemies coming at you at once. I had a ton of times early on where I started taking damage because even though the R2 prompt showed up, I hit the face button too quick for the game to register, which left me still in the same stance I was trying to change out of. Once you learn to hold R2 for that extra second, this becomes a non-issue. One thing about the combat that I really appreciated was its progression. Once you get a grasp of the combat, and more so the camera with its loose lock-on system, enemies become routine. Same combos in the same stance for the same enemy type. However, right when I started to feel this way was getting in the rinse and repeat territory, the game threw in different enemies. They're slight offshoots of what you're already fighting, but they do have better armor and better weapons. Not only that, the further into the game you get, the enemies actually get better at fighting. Instead of just standing there and letting you wail away while breaking their guard, they start to sidestep and actually counter your attacks. They start to rattle off combos of their own and even begin using your own ghost weapons like poison and bombs against you. The Straw Hats fight in real time like they do in the one-on-one duels. Combat doesn't get more difficult just because enemies are randomly given higher attack and more hit points. It gets more difficult because enemies are better equipped and better at countering you. As you blow through waves of grunts, it makes sense that you'll encounter the Mongols' better fighters over time. It makes the player adjust without feeling cheap. I did see some negative reviews complaining about the enemy variants, but what are you gonna do? I mean, you are fighting human enemies. It's a story that's trying to stay somewhat grounded in reality. There's only so much you can do with creating different human soldiers from the feudal age. If the game had you fighting monsters or some type of supernatural forces regularly, and still had only 10 to 12 different enemy types, then I'd say that's when it becomes a problem. But again, you have to work with what you've got, and this game has human enemies and one breed of dogs that were native to the Mongols, so that's what we get because that's what's available within the game's setting. When those enemies got tougher, I had to start using more of the ghost weapons and stealth techniques that I was avoiding earlier in the game. It didn't feel forced either. It felt like I was finally utilizing what the game provided me. When I started using more assassinations and ghost weapons, this was also around the same time that Jin slowly starts to embrace his ghost tactics in the story too. I have no clue if this was a happy accident or if it's what the developers intended to have happen, but for me, using ghost tactics more often lined up perfectly with Jin's character progression, and that felt awesome to play. It was a huge highlight of the game for me. It was like the perfect blend of storytelling and gameplay. But back to those ghost weapons. The interface can get kind of messy when you're switching stances and secondary weapons on the fly, but it's far from hard to manage. Once you do it a couple times and get the hang of it, it's really fun to rush in, take out a couple of dudes, drop a smoke bomb, do a couple stealth kills, switch to the bow and get rid of that archer that lost sight of you, and fly into the next area with the ghost meter full while spamming kunai throws. At first it seems like there's a lot to manage, but they made it so you can switch on the fly very comfortably. Like I said earlier, the combat doesn't do anything groundbreaking, but they made it very fun and very easy to get comfortable using everything it provides. If you really put the effort in to learn the timing of parries, then that's just another tool at your disposal. The combat in this game is really fun and does a fantastic job of hiding the fact that you are just fighting those different offshoots of the same enemies all game. There are a couple technical downsides again though, and these I don't know if I can blame on the base PS4's old technology. Standoffs are the quickest way of replenishing your resolve and thinning out groups, but there were times that the scenery got in the way of my vision. It kinda sucks when you're waiting for an enemy to lunge at you, but there's a tree branch or bush blocking your view, which means you can't see the difference between his fakeouts and his real attack. When you upgrade the standoff and get 3 or more people rushing in, sometimes the first guy you killed is now in your line of sight and completely blocking out your view of your next opponent. As the game went on, I found myself shying away from the standoffs a little bit for things like this. Another reason I stopped doing as many face-offs was because I wanted to actually fight more enemies. Assassinations can be a little inconsistent too. There were a few times where the prompt was on screen, but Jin would just do his regular attack rather than the stealth kill. As the game goes on, Jin will get substantially more powerful. There's positives and negatives to this. Positives, as I said, it's really fun to use all those new techniques and weapons together. It makes sense thematically because Jin was raised as a samurai and should be dominating his lesser equipped and lesser skilled opponents. Whether it's hyperbole or not, Ryuzo even mentions how Jin is the best swordsman on the island. By the end of the game, it did make me wish there were times I had the chance to fight larger groups of enemies at once though. Once you really start utilizing stealth kills, smoke bombs, and the ghost stance, you can take out 7 or 8 guys in a matter of like 15 seconds. Don't get me wrong, it's really satisfying to do that, but it would have been cool to have a handful of scenarios where Jin had to go against a small army by himself all at once, rather than the usual small waves of 5 to 6 guys that get broken into different battle segments. Because Jin gets so many different ways to take people out, there are times you'll blow through fights almost too quickly. It's not like I wanted it to turn into Dynasty Warriors style combat out of nowhere, but maybe just a few more missions that let me really go nuts with Jin. It was a little disappointing towards the endgame when I really started to notice how even the largest Mongol camps were essentially broken up into segments. No matter how much commotion I made, enemies would almost always stand pat in their designated sections and completely ignore the fighting going on right around the corner. But that's also something that I don't know if it's possible to do in the game engine without really straining the frame rate and its ability to run smoothly if there were 10 plus enemies all going for Jin at once. Not a downside by any means, just something I thought would have been kinda cool in the late game when Jin has really built up his reputation as a ghost. What better way to further spread that reputation if another ally or other hostages watch Jin have to use literally every weapon at his disposal to fend off like 20 guys that have him surrounded. Just a pipe dream, but would have been fun to do. But moving on, I've seen a few complaints that Jin is somewhat of a boring or one-note character, and I don't agree. I think he's a very nuanced character. While I was playing, I got the vibe that there were several very different sides of him. What we see for the majority of the game is Jin the samurai, calm, collected, and straightforward. I can see how this could come off as boring to some people, but I felt like that was the side that Jin had to somewhat force. That it's not really him, it's just what he wants others to see and what he felt obligated to portray himself as. It's not often, but we do see him drop this guard a few times in the game. There's times where he talks to Yuna and doesn't have as deep or monotone of a delivery, specifically when the two share a drink before the battle at Yarikawa, laughing and even cracking jokes about how bad the drinks they're sharing taste. When we first meet Ryuzo, you can tell he feels much more relaxed around someone who's an old friend. He's much less on guard and patient when interacting with Kenji because he knows that Kenji isn't someone he needs to constantly act proper around. With the hot springs we talked about earlier, we get very quick bits of his thoughts while taking a break. His voice isn't anywhere near as gruff, and he has moments where he's allowed to think freely. No matter how quickly they come and go, examples like these are the real Jin Sakai, the side that he doesn't want others to see because he needs to maintain his composure, his status as a samurai, and eventually the ghost while fighting a war for his people. The biggest change we see in his personality comes after the liberation of Yarikawa. This is when he finally starts to embrace the ghost over honor. Although he still uses the ghost techniques before this, he's not happy about doing so and is still really conflicted on it until this point in the story. Besides just his fighting style, Jin gets noticeably angrier around this point in the story too. This one-man war against the Mongols is taking its toll on him and his mental state. Being the ghost is also a way for him to have an outlet for all this anger and frustration. Later on, before they retake Castle Shimura, he realizes that Lord Shimura hasn't changed his strategy despite getting reinforcements from the mainland. This fully pushes him into the ghost as he sees the actions of Shimura and the Shogun being completely in vain. Not only them throwing away a huge opportunity for victory, but also losing more Japanese lives unnecessarily in the process. He knows that this new path will destroy his reputation, but the safety of the people on Tsushima is more important to him. Hell, it's not even just the people and warriors of Tsushima that he's concerned with now. He realizes that if they keep fighting the old way, the honorable way, not only will Tsushima fall, but also the mainland will suffer when the Mongols inevitably invade there too. At this point, Jin now has the weight of protecting not just his island, but the entire country of Japan on his shoulders. This is where Jin hits somewhat of a breaking point and knows there's no turning back. The pressures of this, along with the war and death around him, starts to wear him down. He embraces his anger towards the Khan, he embraces the ghost stories that are spreading, and he essentially denounces his life and teachings as a samurai. The final nail in the coffin is when Shimura slaps Jin while they're discussing sneaking in and using poison. I could be forgetting another point, but I'm pretty sure this is the only time where Jin essentially takes credit for what he's doing as well. Even excluding the player choice dialogue options, Jin always gives credit to the people around him and says how he's had a lot of help and isn't fighting alone. In this instance, Jin openly states how he's had to sacrifice everything, how he's the one that's been giving people hope while Shimura has done nothing. Jin never looked for gratitude or praise from anyone during this war, but Shimura dismissing him yet again, let alone striking him, which is very disrespectful for their time frame and culture, that's Jin's breaking point. Shimura isn't wrong though. Jin is being controlled by his emotions, but it's listening to those emotions that defines Jin's story. That's the whole point of his character and the game's story. You're playing the legend of Jin Sakai, the Ghost of Tsushima. Someone vilified by the hierarchy that became a legend and savior to the common people through doing what was necessary, not what was expected. This comes full circle from a conversation between Jin and Shimura in the beginning of the game. When Shimura asks Jin what their code is, Jin recites their virtues like he's reading it out of a book, which Shimura easily recognizes. His follow-up question is what honor really means to Jin. Jin responds, protecting people who can't fight for themselves. This isn't just the commoners by the end of the game. Jin sees the common soldiers and the samurai fighting with Lord Shimura as people who have no say in their own lives. To Jin, even though these are trained warriors, they are also people who can't protect themselves because they're being forced to throw their lives away to fulfill the wishes of their superiors first and foremost. That's Jin's whole character arc, struggling with what's expected of him, and then struggling with his own identity while doing what he believes is the best course of action for the greater good of Japan, even at his own detriment. This isn't supposed to be a character that lets his true feelings and emotions show the majority of the game. Would I have liked to see more of the human, less robotic side of Jin? I'm not sure. I feel like that might take away from the serious tone of the story. This isn't a plot that has many bright spots or opportunities for his true personality to show itself. There's a good chance it would feel out of sync with the game's tone if he was more open. Some of the best characters and stories are the ones that give you just enough of a glimpse to understand them, but leave you craving more. I think that fits Jin's personality completely. It's not just with Jin though. That's how they wanted to portray all the characters in the game, as to stay consistent with a serious plot. Kenji is the closest thing we get to comic relief or a goofy side character, and even he gets more serious after Taka's death and towards the climax of the story. Everyone else is pretty stoic because the game is telling a somber story that it doesn't want to divert from. This isn't like a Rockstar or Naughty Dog game that can kind of flip-flop between violent and lighthearted scenes at will. Would it make sense for Yuna and Jin to have a lively conversation after Taka's death or right after a big fight? Not at all. It did make sense for them to share a moment before a battle though, because they don't know if they'll live through it. After everything Naruto went through, could you picture him dropping his guard and being a jolly character for a couple scenes? It would be too jarring with the way the story and game are presented. Because the game never really strays from its serious tone, I felt like that helped put more emotion behind its bigger character twists. When we first meet Yuriko and you see her having trouble with her memory, you can see her death coming a mile away. When Taka wants to start fighting, you can see that death coming a mile away too. But the constant serious and bleak tone leaves you wondering how it's going to happen more than if it's going to, and they did a great job in their execution. This game really has some scenes that are just awesome and memorable. The previously mentioned ghost dance scene is great. When I first played that and saw Jin start going nuts, I literally said, "Holy shit," out loud. When they revealed that Nario's brother was actually alive but the Mongols had been horribly torturing him the whole time, I said the same thing, only in a much sadder tone. The opening cinematic is kinda intense, and the final fight with Lord Shimura is a tearjerker. When you first meet up with him, you see the circle-style duel arena behind Jin while he plays his flute, and get the sinking feeling that a fight against Shimura is coming. When the two leave, it throws you off guard. The ride and dialogue make you think it won't happen. Shimura is still serious in his warnings to Jin, but he also stops to help a stuck peasant instead of just riding past. I feel like this is an action that Shimura wouldn't have taken earlier in the game. When you get to the cemetery and realize that you actually are going to fight Shimura, it hits a lot harder with the extra build-up they added. You can feel the pain in Lord Shimura as he tells Jin that the Shogun has declared him a traitor. A pain that Jin doesn't let show until he delivers the killing blow if the player decides to go that route. Leading up to this, it's Shimura, not Jin, that has tears in his eyes the entire scene. Shimura can't even write his haiku without crying and seems like he's a second away from breaking down the entire time. If you spare him, then Jin never lets any emotion show and just leaves, feeling like his country and family are the ones that have committed the actual betrayal. The cinematics and storytelling is all just done so goddamn well in this game. But let's get into some of the other characters now. I did feel like the payoff wasn't great for some of them. Not that I didn't enjoy it, just a little meh with the way they ended. Masako and Ishikawa were definitely a little lackluster when everything was said and done. With Ishikawa and Tomoe, it always felt like there was something in the story that we weren't being told. That coupled with the fact that Ishikawa is just kind of a dick, made me never really fully trust him, and I feel like that's what the game was going for. When we get to the conclusion of their stories, it just felt inconsistent. It kind of fell flat with me. I felt like the game was trying too hard to make me feel bad for Tomoe, but there isn't really a whole lot of reason to feel bad for her. Yeah, again, Ishikawa was a dick and a tough teacher, but that shouldn't be enough to drive her to help the Mongols. Being raised from nothing to becoming the daughter of a lord is a massive opportunity in their society. Saying once in a lifetime is probably downplaying how bad the odds of that happening to you are. We're supposed to feel bad for her because the Mongols betrayed her, but she willingly helped them after she was captured. They didn't come asking for her help, she convinced them to free her from imprisonment. It's the enemy. Clearly they would use her knowledge and skills to their advantage and discard her when they were done with her. Why should we feel sorry because she was naive and believed the promises of a foreign warlord? She says she usually convinced the Mongols to spare lives, but then why was she teaching them battle strategies and better archery techniques? Did she really think they'd never use these new skills against Tsushima? She also frames Ishikawa and Jin for her crimes at one point too. Tomoe straight up betrayed the Japanese and sided with the Mongols, so I felt like Jin was oddly forgiving with her. She never did anything according to what was right or wrong, she only ever acted for her own self-benefit. Jin mentions how she fought alongside them in the end, and that means something, but he just glosses over everything she did before that. The only reason she even fights with them is because the Mongols are now hunting her since her usefulness to them was gone. She completely uses Jin and Ishikawa to her advantage and gets away scot-free while both of them seem to be very aware of her plan. They say her tipping them off about Umugi Cove doesn't erase her past crimes, but it feels like Jin decides that's exactly what's going to happen. Hell, the final scene even ends with Ishikawa making Jin promise him that he won't repeat his mistakes of teaching the wrong person. I feel like there's a few plot points in this arc that don't get answers. Tomoe claims that Ishikawa tried to kill her, but Ishikawa claims that she attacked him. She claims that he drove her to the Mongols, but he claims that she always had a darker side he blames himself for overlooking. Who's telling the truth? It's all finger-pointing. But the main difference in this finger-pointing is Ishikawa's kind of a jerk, where Tomoe has a trail of bodies. The evidence is way worse on her side. In Tomoe's side of the story, she seems to pin her actions on the Mongols, but there's a dying peasant who openly says that she was also a prisoner, but then immediately was set free, then killed his wife along with the others in camp. Multiple times we get to see the end results of what her archery in the hands of the Mongols has led to. It's just like, what the hell? Why is Tomoe, who we keep hearing is this dangerous warrior that turned on her people, which she definitely did, held to a different standard than the rest of the island's population? It seems like she really was this master archer and great warrior that can't be trusted that Ishikawa played up. So why should we try and see her side of the story? If she's so skilled and so dangerous, why couldn't she just escape the Mongols herself after she was released? She seems more than skilled enough to do that. Why did she have to go along with everything for so long and even plan attacks against the Japanese people in the process? The only reason she didn't kill more people was because Jin and Ishikawa ruined her plans a couple times. Ishikawa isn't supposed to be all that likable, but I kind of appreciated how he stuck to his guns about having to take out Tomoe when Jin seems conflicted. Tomoe just came off as kind of like a spoiled child who never learned her lesson and blamed her poor choices on everyone but herself. Jin even makes a joke about the possibility of her actually making it to Kyoto when she tells him that she plans on having her servants rob people blind when they stay at the inn. So now at this point, Jin's joking about her going to the mainland and ripping people off. Like, why does she get a pass? I don't see the redeeming qualities in her, and I don't understand why Jin was so forgiving. It felt like the Tomoe portion of the story was really the only time that Jin was somewhat poorly written. I don't know. By the end, the whole arc felt kinda inconsistent, especially with Jin showing more and more bloodlust towards the Mongols and anyone who aided them. It just felt weird to have him be so understanding of Tomoe's self-inflicted problems at that point in the story. Masako's arc is unfortunately a victim of its own setting. Honoring and respecting your family is a huge deal in Japan today, but it was everything during these feudal times. The only thing that would override family was commands from your lord or shogun, as they are seen as the ultimate authority. Masiko's sister being the culprit because she didn't like the husband she was given just felt anticlimactic though, and I saw it coming as her story started to reveal more information. In America, if you don't like your relatives, you can just not see them anymore, and it isn't a big deal. So this sister/family betrayal thing didn't hit home for me in the way that the game intended. Masako constantly just kills people instead of trying to actually learn what happened. Yeah, she's supposed to be unhinged and not thinking correctly, but I felt like Jin had to remind her that dead men can't give information like 5 or 6 times. When she briefly turned on Jin, at first I didn't really fight back, thinking I had an option to kill her or not. After a few seconds to think about it, I thought, fuck her, let's take her out if she's trying to attack me now too. At least with Ishikawa and Tomoe, it didn't feel repetitive. It felt like there was more variance with each new mission and plot point, even if they were plot points I didn't completely think landed. Masako, on the other hand, felt repetitive after her first couple missions. Find some new lead, seek them out, kill a few Mongols, Masako goes nuts, Jin leaves trying to be understanding of her grief, although he has to give her a lecture yet again. Rinse and repeat. As far as the characters go, I was definitely the least invested in her. Also, why were there samurais at her sister's estate? Did they just ignore Shimura's request during the initial invasion? Wouldn't someone notice that, 5 to 10 samurai from her sister's clan weren't present? When only 80 samurai were there for the fight at Komita, that's like missing about 10 to 15% of your army in hindsight, which is a pretty damn big deal in battle. If they were samurai from the mainland, why did Masako's sister get preferential treatment over everyone else looking for refuge in Tsushima? She then openly admits to everything right in front of them. I know they're supposed to serve their lords, but wouldn't admitting to killing multiple family members, some of which being children, make them pause for a second? I just really wasn't a huge fan of her arc by the end. In terms of the plot and story-related missions, Masako was the weakest side character for me. Naruto, on the other hand, did the opposite. I didn't take him too seriously at first. It's for the stupidest of reasons, although it's something I couldn't help but notice. When we first meet him, he tells us how he was held in a covered pit and barely given any water and no food. So why is his character model kinda chunky then? Come on, you look pretty well fed compared to everyone else I've met, but you claim you've been in a pit without food since Komita fell? Little things like this in games just bug the shit out of me. It's such an oversight in character design. Unless Naruto was by far the fattest person on the island before this happened, there's no reason that a character who tells you they were starved by the enemy should have the heaviest character model of all the people we meet on Tsushima Island outside of the bigger Mongols. I don't know. Stuff like that with character design just comes off as so lazy to me. How can developers create these massive games but not recognize a disconnect like the guy who was written in as a starved prisoner looks kinda fat? Whatever. Anyway, his missions are pretty generic. Go here, Mongols are attacking, kill Mongols, rinse and repeat. Towards the end though, it starts to pick up. Him feeling inadequate compared to his brother's accomplishments and not being sure if he even wants to continue as a warrior monk was a little intriguing. Not to mention his whole side story about survivor's guilt. When we get to the end and the monk tells us not to enter the temple, I fully expected to see Enjo's dead body there as somewhat of a Mongol trophy. When he was there, living but mutilated and crying, that was kinda intense. I was not expecting that. Go back and watch that scene. Even the look on Jin's face is one of shock after everything he's seen and done. The scene after Naruto slaughters the Mongol camp is a nice touch too. Naruto says that he believes he did what the ghost would, and instead of arguing, Jin gets it. He doesn't try and tell Naruto what he did was wrong or unnecessary. He just tells him that he can't give up now and to keep moving forward for the people of Tsushima. Where I wasn't too invested in the beginning, I really liked Naruto's arc by the end. This was perfectly timed too after I had started to lose interest in Masako and Ishikawa's stories. Kenji was a character that I thought I was going to find to be pretty annoying, but I ended up liking him too. I enjoyed the interactions with him and Jin. Considering all of Kenji's screw-ups, Jin clearly has a little bit of a soft spot for him, and treats him more like a dumb little brother instead of the swindler that he really is. I want to touch on Shimura, Taka, and Yuna altogether though. These three characters all care greatly about Jin in their own way, but I also took them to represent the different social classes of Tsushima. Shimura obviously represents the top tier hierarchy, Taka represents the middle class or peasants, and Yuna the bottom class of thieves and bandits. What the game does fantastically is turn the bottom class and the lord class upside down with these characters. Before we get into that though, let's get Taka out of the way quickly. When we first rescue him, he's doing whatever he can just to survive, and luckily he has a trade skill or he would have been immediately killed as fodder for the war. Since he's a good blacksmith, he's forced into slavery by the Mongols. Despite working him half to death, even they decide that's not enough and think he can be replaced. Once he's freed, he does whatever he can to try and help Jin, gaining a pretty deep admiration for him in the process. Not just because Jin saved him, but because he believes in the ghost and his quest to liberate the island. Where he's scared of battle and claims to not be a soldier at first, eventually he grows braver and decides that he needs to fight for Tsushima and not just wait on the sidelines. We see everyone from the common peasants to the citizens and warriors of Yarikawa have this same change in attitude as Jin slowly becomes more successful in his battles. None of the people struggling the most seem to have a problem with Jin's methods. In fact, they seem to support it the most. They recognize and respect everything he's doing is for their betterment by any means necessary. Taka attempting to take up arms and become a true fighter also parallels the growing militia that supports the Ghost by the end of the game. But his death at the hands of the Khan also reminds us how their class is still suffering the most despite their best efforts. Both the samurai and nobles still faced death, but think about it. As a feudal Japanese citizen, would you rather be recognized as a warrior that died with honor, or forced into slavery while watching your home be destroyed and your loved ones get slaughtered? I felt like Taka represented that struggle of the common people in Tsushima during the war. Whether it was just for story purposes or meant to have some type of actual symbolism, Taka being directly killed by the Khan kind of reinforced my thinking too. Now, Yuna and Shimura couldn't be more of opposites. Throughout most of the game, I had a bad feeling about Shimura, that he would turn on us or become a legit villain by the game's end. If you just give it the face value look, he does turn on us and come off that way, but he's a much deeper character than that. His actions and his thoughts really don't line up at times. Normally this is where I'd criticize a character for being inconsistent, but I think he's extremely well written. He's going through all the same conflicting emotions that Jin is, but he can't give up his honor code unlike Jin. Shimura is too own school for his own good, and a lot of this comes from his higher standing. Yeah, Jin is a lord and leader of Clan Sakai, but Shimura is the Jito of Tsushima. Essentially, he's in charge of the entire island and answers directly to the shogun. This extra step up in the feudal hierarchy is enough to hold Shimura in his ways. When I brought up that flashback conversation where Jin says honor means protecting people, Shimura acknowledges Jin's good intentions, but follows it up with honor means faithfully serving your superiors, always keeping that integrity and self-control. Where Shimura recognizes that Jin is just reciting his father's definition of honor at first, Jin kinda answers back to Shimura the same way, responding with, "You say it like it's easy to act on that." Jin realizes that Shimura is basically reciting what the shogun wants. The telling thing about Shimura's definition of honor is when he says that it's never easy and he struggles with it every day. This shows that Shimura is aware of the clear flaws in their ideology, but he chooses to follow them anyway. That's what Shimura recognizes as strength and what eventually drives a wedge between himself and Jin. Having that discipline to act on things that you don't agree with because it's supposed to be for the greater good of Japan and Tsushima. In a weird way, Jin takes this conversation to heart. He just chooses the opposite path that Shimura does. Once we get closer to the endgame, we realize that this early conversation is what defines both Jin and Shimura's personalities. Jin discards what he was taught in order to make his own choices. On the other hand, Shimura embraces what he was taught and discards any of his own feelings in order to rule. Where I didn't trust him for a good chunk of the game, I really felt like Shimura was a tragic character by the end. Whether he was spared or killed, I genuinely felt bad for him. He truly cares about Jin and does love him like a son. When he first tells Jin to give up the ghost and blame Yuna for his perceived war crimes, this comes off as an extremely hypocritical move by Shimura. I mean, I guess it kinda is depending on how each player interprets it, but I took it as Shimura actually bending his honor code in order to protect Jin. He isn't asking just Jin to lie, but it's a lie to the shogun that he would also be fully complicit in. By the end of the game, Shimura is openly crying while sadly telling Jin that the shogun has requested his head as punishment. Shimura adheres to his honor code so strongly that he tries to kill Jin, a person who he wanted to inherit his family's legacy and be legally known as his son. Shimura singled out Jin as the man he chose to rule Tsushima after he was gone. For Shimura to bend his honor code earlier and plead with Jin to turn over Yuna as the ghost, this just goes to show how much Shimura truly cared about Jin. Throughout the entire game, Shimura is unwavering about his code of honor and loyalty to the Shogun, except for this one scene. When you have all the information in hindsight, this is Shimura attempting to do what Jin describes honor as, protecting people. In this case, protecting Jin. He's not thinking with the same integrity and discipline that he preaches. He's trying to keep it together the day before when Jin questions his battle tactics because, in a way, he knows that Jin makes a good argument, but lets his emotions get the better of him and slaps Jin for it. This leads to him trying to place the blame on Yuna for the poisonings. In this situation, she's kinda just wrong place, wrong time when it comes to her alliance with Jin. Shimura using Yuna as a scapegoat goes against everything he stands for, breaking his own rules in a desperate attempt to clear Jin's name. On the surface, it seems like a shitty move, but it's his panicked reaction to knowing that Jin will be tried as a war criminal. Shimura knows exactly what's coming for Jin when the Shogun hears about this. Everyone remembers Shimura in tears at the end, but he's also in tears here too when he burns the letter legitimizing Jin as his son. Shimura is fighting one hell of an internal battle between his duty as the Jito and his love for Jin. In the end, Shimura chooses that duty as the Jito, fulfilling his role as an authority figure in the Japanese hierarchy even though it's clearly not the path he personally wants to go down. There's a nice parallel between Jin and Shimura. They really aren't all that different in their thinking. They both want the same things, they just go down opposite paths to try and get there. The dynamic between Jin and Shimura is told so well and really one of the best in recent memory. The X factor in all of this is Yuna. Lord Shimura openly looks down on her and legit takes advantage of her on more than one occasion by asking her to keep doing more for the war efforts instead of initially honoring her request for passage off the island. This is because he sees her as nothing more than a petty thief and bandit who's no better than the raiders that killed Jin's father years ago. Despite Jin's allegiance with her, she's basically the lowest of the low to Shimura, since he only knows her by her standing before the invasion and views her as a negative influence on Jin. Where Shimura represents the flaws in upper-class feudal society, Yuna represents that not everyone on the bottom rung is as they appear either. She's had a very difficult life that led her to where she's at now. She's not just some mindless bandit, she's someone who's made mistakes and committed crimes in order to just keep herself and Taka alive. Being a former slave herself, she wants no part of the Mongol invasion. The first half of her arc is solely focused on rescuing Taka, fulfilling her obligations to Jin, and getting the hell off the island. Tsushima is a place that hasn't been too kind to her, so she doesn't feel a need to really fight for the island. Her struggle is something that Shimura and Jin couldn't begin to understand since they grew up in what amounts to luxury lifestyles back then. The difference is, Jin starts to empathize with her and Shimura never does. It hits a little harder in the mid-game when Shimura looks down on Yuna, but don't forget that Jin kinda did the same thing in the early game. The only thing that stopped him from being as condescending as Shimura was his gratitude for her saving his life at Komeda. Once he gets to know her, Jin quickly stops looking at her as a low-class citizen and just as a person, then eventually as an ally and true friend. Yuna is a character that shows everything isn't black and white. While it seems like this is supposed to be Jin's job in the story, I really feel like it was Yuna who fulfilled this role. For the majority of the game, her sole concern is to just keep surviving, do what's necessary to get herself and Taka off the island, and they'll worry about what happens after that later. It isn't until Taka is killed that she commits herself to fighting the Mongols. She isn't fighting for the people of Tsushima as much as she's fighting for Taka's memory and to help Jin. Even though they start on different ideologies, this is something that Jin starts to adopt in his own thinking as he becomes closer with Yuna. He relates the way she had to do whatever was necessary to survive and protect Taka into his quest for survival of Tsushima Island. When they share a drink before the Battle of Yarikawa, Yuna shares a story about when her alcoholic mother broke Taka's arm. She decides that she needed to take Taka and leave, forget everything she knew, and not look back because staying in that stale, dangerous situation wouldn't lead to any good, just more of history repeating itself. This is what makes Jin fully realize that he needs to give up everything he was taught as a samurai. To go into the unknown because fighting the same ways a samurai does will do nothing but lead to the same past failures. Just like Taka's death pushes Yuna towards staying and fighting the Mongols, Jin also uses that as further motivation to embrace his role as the Ghost. Jin sees a strength in Yuna, a perceived low-class citizen that he just doesn't in the upper hierarchy who is too afraid to act on their own thoughts. When a panicked Shimura asks Jin to blame Yuna for the actions of the Ghost, this is the point of no return. Jin chooses Yuna and her ways instead of the traditional honor code of the samurai. The story turns the samurai trope on its head a little bit with this. Taka and Yuna are the catalyst for Jin to side with the common citizens over his lords and rulers. When Jin needed support the most, he found that in a thief instead of his country or family. Now, this is a topic that has lost steam as of late, but I feel like it should be noted that Yuna is an extremely well-written female main character too. She doesn't fall into any forced cliches or lazy writing. It's really the opposite. I never spend any time thinking about her as a good female character, but just as a good character in general, which is the way it should be. Let's wrap up the characters with the antagonists. I really liked what they did with Ryuzo too. Just like Shimura, it's easy to look at Ryuzo and see a hypocritical or inconsistent character, but once again, I didn't. Is he jealous, has an inferiority complex, and kinda just a little stupid? Definitely. But those are traits that are written into his character and not used as unexplained plot conveniences. His flaws are directly written into his character and story, they don't just come out of nowhere because the plot demands it. Ryuzo is someone who has a pretty big inferiority complex, and that mindset leads him into making some of those pretty dumb decisions. But there are choices that we can at least understand why he's making them. We don't get a full description of Ryuzo's upbringing, but he was likely in somewhat of a no man's land in terms of cultural standing. He takes part in Lord Nagao's tournament, but is defeated by Jin. We know that Ryuzo wasn't from a powerful family, but he couldn't be a normal peasant if he had a relationship with Jin, as well as an invite to this tournament. He was likely somewhere in the middle. Not viewed as all that important by the common people, but also not recognized as a true peer by the higher class either. This is why Ryuzo is so bitter about his defeat to Jin. He saw this as an opportunity to prove himself by winning and becoming a samurai. Jin was already born into a powerful family and going to be a samurai regardless. Ryuzo had a lot more riding on the outcome of this tournament than Jin did. What made it worse was it's implied that Jin won pretty easily. Afterwards, an embarrassed Ryuzo immediately left and joined the Straw Hats as a sword for hire. During the couple years between these events and the Mongol invasion, Ryuzo gets pretty jaded with the samurai class structure. When it used to be his main priority, now he's fully committed to the Straw Hats and even becomes their leader after the battle at Komoda. He views them as people who accepted him for what he was and now feels a great responsibility to keep them alive. With the Mongols winning the war, the Straw Hats begin to struggle and starve just like everyone else, which leads Ryuzo to again feel like a failure. The pressure to keep his men safe is what prompts Ryuzo to turn on Jin and the Japanese people. When faced with the decision to pick sides, he sees the Mongols as the safer bet. This isn't a decision he takes lightly, and he's pretty torn up about it. Like Jin becoming the Ghost to save the island, Ryuzo becomes a traitor because he thinks it's the course of action he needs to take in order to save his men. When Jin retakes Castle Shimura, Ryuzo is a broken man. He realizes that he chose the wrong side, and that decision to side with the Mongols has been what actually doomed his men. Not only that, he's also killed fellow Japanese citizens in the process. This is where Ryuzo shows his true colors. All the choices and his prior betrayals were done with somewhat good intentions, as backwards as that sounds. They were good intentions as far as protecting his Straw Hats, who he now saw as family. He knew he wasn't doing the right thing, but he thought he was making the smarter bet in order to save their lives. He viewed it as not being all that different from Jin's quest to save Shimura. Once their defeat is sealed, he tries to manipulate Jin into sparing him, claiming that he could have killed him, but didn't earlier as a show of good faith. While that's kinda true, Ryuzo is splitting hairs at best, and basically trying to play both sides at this point. He only kept him alive so that the Khan could try and convince Jin to surrender. It's not really as innocent as Ryuzo tries to portray. The Khan then orders him to kill Jin, but Ryuzo also knows that's not likely to happen, so he plays his trump card and tries to work off Jin's compassion. Tries to save himself by having Jin claim that Ryuzo was a spy working on the inside the entire time. This shows just how lost Ryuzo truly is at this point in the story. Where Shimura has a lapse in his code and tries to overlook Jin's actions, there's no chance he would do the same for someone like Ryuzo. Even if Jin had agreed, he would still be faced with a very likely punishment of death by Shimura for his and the Straw Hat's actions. Ryuzo picked a side, and his side lost. In the end, that desire he had for acceptance and leadership was what led to his downfall. This leads us into the last main character, and that's Khotun Khan. He's a pretty one-note villain, but he's one that's pulled off really well. His character has a great aura around him, and every time he talks, you're glued to his scenes. Where the samurai have their code, Khotun has his own rules that he plays by too. This wasn't some invasion where they just played a numbers game and went in unprepared. He teaches himself their language as well as learning their fighting tactics and traditions. Khotun is a very good war general and not just some bloodthirsty invader. The Mongols aren't looking to conquer an empty island though. They want to bring the people they defeat into their society and army. They show their force on Komeda and demand an immediate surrender. Khotun knows this not only preserves his own forces, but then gains them that much more in the form of the people of Tsushima. He routinely tries to take what he considers to be the peaceful route. Just like all the other characters, Khotun fights by his own ways and beliefs. His strategy is to win by any means necessary, while oddly enough, trying to spare as much death as possible. This is why he keeps Shimura alive. Because he's taught himself about those traditions, he knows that if Shimura eventually relents, the entire island will very likely follow suit and surrender too. This leads to less death on both sides, which increases what the Mongols see as their population, while also preserving his military strength. In the Khan's eyes, this is a win-win for both sides. They get to live while he gets to move on to the next target. It's not like their lives would be awesome living under Mongol rule, but that doesn't really matter in the eyes of Khotun when he's the one in a position of power making threats and demands. Historically, this was something that the Mongols practiced too. A good antagonist needs their goals and mindset clearly defined. With Khotun, you know exactly what kind of a man he is and what his intentions are. In the endgame, when he realizes that Jin and the rest of the island are really gaining momentum, it's win by any means possible. It's kind of ironic too, because when he's finally defeated by Jin, he faces death kinda like a samurai. He tells Jin that if he's killed, another will come and the Mongols won't be forgotten. He doesn't turn into a cowardly villain and beg for his life. His last words are those of a warning, that he might not have succeeded, but more will follow in his footsteps. One last reminder of how the Mongol people fight and conquer. That Jin's just delaying the inevitable. At the time, this was pretty true. The Mongol Empire had taken over a massive portion of the continent, but we know that historically, they failed on both attempts to take Japan. There isn't a whole lot of depth to Khotun, but he's still a great villain. He's very straightforward, and what you see is what you get style character. I thought his ideology and personality fit perfectly with the story that was told, though. Without getting into every little story beat, I guess that about covers everything. Yeah, there are a couple technical issues, and it does fall into some of the problems that the majority of open world games find themselves in, but these are all pretty minor issues in the grand scheme of things. As a whole, Ghost of Tsushima is a damn good game from both a gameplay and storytelling standpoint. While it does follow a lot of the tried and true mission-based game progression formula, it does that very, very well. The characters and storytelling are fantastic, and the combat never got dull for me. It's up there as one of the generation's best games in my opinion. If you've watched this all the way through and haven't played the game yet for some reason, go do it. You won't be disappointed. On a closing note, since you did watch all the way through, thank you for doing that, and I do hope you enjoyed the video. You guys know all about the like, comment, and subscribe stuff. Do so if you give a shit. But yeah, that's all I got for this one. See you guys.